Racist police officer mistakenly arrests captain because he is black. What follows is surprising fire.
You think you versatile?
Think again. Today, we present to you the incredible story of a police officer who, by arresting a superior simply because of his skin color, had no idea that he would trigger a chain reaction that would disrupt much more than his career. But that's not all. What happens next will shock, inspire, and maybe even make you see things from a different perspective. So stay with us, and above all, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our next videos.
The story begins now.
The summer heat beat mercilessly on the cobblestones of the quiet streets of Vichy. The sun's rays set slowly, casting a golden light on the facades of the houses and creating soft shadows under the trees. The city seemed bathed in an almost unreal tranquility. The birds flew in a graceful ballet, gliding between the branches, their song filling the air with a soothing melody, as if the world around them lived in a parallel reality, a space where time passed peacefully, far from everyday concerns. It was one of those days when social tensions, which had been simmering silently, seemed to dissipate in the heat of a summer afternoon. The main street was deserted, with just a few residents walking in the shade, enjoying the light breeze that was picking up. The children had already returned home, and the adults found themselves on their balconies or in their gardens, enjoying the calm of the end of the day. There was nothing in this suspended moment that could have predicted the imminent upheaval. However, it is precisely this apparent tranquility that would be shattered by an event that would shake not only the life of Matthew Lemoine, but also that of many others, far away in the corners of society. An incident which, although innocuous at first glance, would become a powerful symbol of a reality deeply rooted in the very structure of the system. Captain Matthew Lemoine, 43, was heading towards his house, tired but calm. It had been a long day, like so many others, but the work routine had made it a habit. He had worn the uniform of the National Police for 20 years, a career punctuated by sacrifices, but also successes. Matthew was a determined man, a man of principles, respected by both his colleagues and his superiors. He started in a neighborhood brigade, in a difficult city where violence and poverty left no room for indifference. But he had climbed the ranks with patience, acquiring responsibilities, and reaching a position of command where his sense of justice and diplomacy were often called upon to diffuse explosive situations. In his eyes you could read experience, but also a certain fatalism, a wisdom acquired over the years. He had learned to deal with a world where skin color, even for a man of his status, could influence the perception of others. It was nothing new, not something he was unaware of, but he also knew that his actions, his professionalism, were there to protect him, to legitimize his existence. He believed deeply in fairness, and it was this principle that guided him every day in his career. That evening, he quietly drove his company car, a black sedan with a smooth and immaculate body, a discreet symbol of his status, but also of his years of service. The car, simple but powerful, carried him through the heart of this quiet residential neighborhood. As the sun's rays grew fainter and the warm afternoon air caressed his face through the slightly open windows. This journey, which he had made 1,000 times, seemed special that day. Maybe it was the light that made the road brighter, or maybe it was the fatigue that made each moment more precious. But nothing in his thoughts suggested the event that would change his trajectory that night. Officer Damien Durand, for his part, was roaming the streets of the neighborhood looking for his next check. Young, impulsive, and yet already marked by a heavy routine, he made his rounds in a quiet area where the majority of residents did not cause problems. However, Durand saw himself as a man of power, a man capable of imposing his authority and judging others according to his own criteria. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, in an environment where order and discipline were sacrosanct values, but where racial prejudice was sometimes as present as the air we breathed. Durand never sought to question these ideas. It was simpler that way. After all, the uniform gave him the legitimacy to act as he saw fit, to judge and control what was around him. He believed he knew who the good and bad people were in society, and his gaze often fell on those he considered out of place. As fate would have it, at the corner of a street, Durand saw a silhouette that caught his attention.
A black sedan.
A stylish vehicle, but seemingly out of place in this quiet neighborhood. And suddenly an insidious thought arises in his mind. Why would a black man drive a car like that? It was a reflex, a suspicion that he was not even aware of having, but which, at that precise moment, disrupted his judgment. He had no rational explanation for this, but the thought stuck with him like dogma. Agent Durand chooses to follow this baseless intuition. He turned on his sirens and ordered the car to pull over. He had the power to do it, and in his head he told himself it was justified. After all, who would have dared to raise the slightest objection to him? He knew that the man behind the wheel would first of all be a respectful citizen, a good citizen like him. But in reality, he knew nothing about the man he had just arrested. When the sedan's engine died with a low purr, Matthew slowly lowered the window, thinking about what that meant. He was tired of having to explain his place in this society again and again, but he did it with the calm he knew how to adopt. With a slight smile on his lips, he prepared to greet the situation with the dignity that characterized him. Durand approached, his steps heavy, almost hesitant, but charged with an authority that he thought necessary to claim. His eyes scanned the car, then fixed on the captain's face. He did not yet know to what extent this meeting would transform him. But he was certain of one thing: he had to impose his law. His gaze became more piercing, and with cold arrogance he said, "Are you aware that this car is registered in your name, sir?" Officer Durand's voice, biting and full of contempt, resonated in the warm evening air, breaking the apparent tranquility of the street. There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to mask the arrogance that emanated from it. The harshness of his words betrayed a desire for domination, a deep belief in his own superiority, as if his uniform and his young years of service gave him absolute legitimacy to judge, question, and control. Matthew knew this type of situation well. He was a man of principle and calm, but he was no fool. He had often crossed paths with those who, driven by their prejudices, believed they had the right to question his existence and his accomplishments. He knew that this insistence on having him prove something was not rooted in the logic of facts, but in the racist and insidious impulse of a system that did not want to see beyond skin color. Yet he remained calm, choosing each word carefully. He was used to these unjustified interrogations, these barely veiled judgments which were imposed on him as a form of test. This kind of scene no longer frightened him, but each time, the anguish of injustice squeezed his throat a little tighter. "It's my vehicle, yes. And I am also captain of the National Police. I'm on duty now, although I'm going home. You can check my information." The firmness of his voice was not an attempt at dominance, but a calm invitation to rationality. It offered the agent everything he needed to do his job properly. But Durand's attitude did not seem to seek the truth. He was more interested in the idea of destabilizing his interlocutor, of humiliating him, as if each word spoken was an additional blow in a battle for power that he believed he had already won. "I know very well who you are," replied Durand, in a disdainful tone, as if he were already in possession of an absolute truth, that of a world where some men were simply less worthy than others. "But are you sure you have the necessary authorizations to drive this type of car? It seems like you got a little too lost in your status as a police officer. You really have to have one hell of a network to get stuff like this, huh?"
Matthew felt the tension intensify.
The remark, although veiled under the appearance of banality, carried with it a heavy accusation, an insidious insinuation that struck him right in the heart. It was more than just a matter of status or network. It was about power and legitimacy. The idea behind it was clear: a man of his color should not drive a car like that. Not in a neighborhood like this, not with such prestige. This question, apparently innocent, was in reality a mirror held up to the face of the society in which he lived, a society which continued to judge, to categorize, to exclude. Matthew gritted his teeth. The racial innuendo, as subtle as it was there, obvious. He knew well that it was not only the car he was calling into question, but his very right to own it, to enjoy it. He knew that, in the agent's mind, his belonging to a certain social or ethnic group cancelled, so to speak, his merit, his work, his years of service. It only served as another reminder that he wasn't supposed to be here, that he wasn't supposed to have what he had. Matthew felt the growing annoyance, but he forced himself to remain calm. Everything would go wrong if this confrontation became a question of ego, of poorly controlled anger. The situation had already taken a nasty turn, but he knew that everything could get worse if he didn't control his emotions. He had already experienced this kind of tension far too often in his career to allow himself to be carried away by impulsiveness. I assure you, my vehicle is perfectly legal. If you want to check, I can provide you with all the information. If it's not a problem, I would ask you to let me continue on my way. He said the words in an even, almost disembodied tone, but frustration boiled beneath his skin. Officer Durand seemed in no hurry to let him go. Far from that. His eyes narrowed, scrutinizing every detail as if trying to find something to complain about, something that would confirm his preconceived view of things. He stood up, in a movement that betrayed his desire to control, to impose a form of domination. He felt like this meeting was a test, an opportunity to prove his power. I have reason to believe that a man like you, with your skin color, does not deserve to own this type of property. Where are you really from? It's because of people like you that things are the way they are in this country. The sentence, raw, sharp, seemed to come from another time. But yet, it carried a truth that he was not ready to face, that of a society where systemic racism was hidden behind the appearance of justice and fairness. Matthew felt a cold shiver run down his spine.
The violence of the words sounded louder than the car sirens.
But he couldn't afford to respond to the provocation, not at that moment. Durand, obviously, did not realize the magnitude of what he had just said. He was too caught up in his own prejudices to see the line he had just crossed. Matthew sat up straighter in his seat, his hand tight on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. He was used to these kinds of insidious comments, judgments hidden behind well-crafted sentences. But that evening, something inside him awoke. It wasn't just an insult to his status, to his dignity. It was an insult to the dignity of all those who, like him, had to fight to have a legitimate place in this society. And he would not allow that. He turned his head slowly towards Durand, his eyes staring into hers with icy intensity. He was calm, but there was a determination in his voice that left no room for discussion. I am a police captain. You are an agent of the same institution. I ask you, under our code of ethics, to tell me the legal reason for my arrest. Otherwise, I will be forced to file a complaint for abuse of power. Matthew's voice resonated with a calm authority, but also with a determination that Durand had not anticipated. At that precise moment, the agent realized that the man he had in front of him was not a simple colleague, but a superior, a man who, far from submitting to the passive aggression of the situation, chose to defend himself by relying on his know-how and his respect for the rules. Surprise could be seen in the eyes of Durand, who, until then, had never had to confront this type of resistance in his own environment. Bullying had become a form of habit for him, a way to reinforce his power against those he perceived as weaker. The agent tried to regain control of the situation, but the scene became more and more embarrassing for him. He searched for words for a moment, but his gaze fled, as if trapped in a web he himself had woven. He knew that Matthew Lemoyne, a respected man, capable of handling much more than banal interrogations, was not going to be intimidated so easily. The moment the ethics argument was invoked, the agent understood that this was now more than a simple routine check. The question of legality, authority, hierarchy, and even racism came into the discussion, and that was where Durand lost his footing. During a short silence, where tension was rising, Durand discreetly called his superior, visibly overwhelmed. The man on the other end of the line, a senior captain, first listened to the situation, then gave his verdict in a calm and authoritative voice, but tinged with slight concern. Matthew, you are where you are supposed to be, I assume? The question, formulated in a seemingly innocuous manner, carried with it all the weight of an institution that was not ready to see its flaws exposed. Agent Durand, his eyes shifting, took the call with a hint of nervousness. His superior had just made a final decision. Matthew Lemoyne, the captain, was to be immediately released. The incident, which seemed trivial a few minutes earlier, took on a whole new dimension. However, This was only the beginning of the consequences. While Matthew, without another word, left for his vehicle under the watchful gaze of a few witnesses, the information spread quickly. Local journalists, alerted by witnesses to the scene, began to take a closer interest in the incident. Within hours, the affair was widely publicized. The first lines of the articles left no room for doubt. A racist police officer had just illegally questioned a superior from the same institution, for no apparent reason, but above all without any legal justification. Captain Lemoyne, a black man, respected in his profession, unwillingly became the face of a scandal that would deeply shake the national police force. The popular reaction was immediate. Massive support for Matthew, and outrage at the attitude of an agent who had crossed the limits of respect and ethics. But what was even more shocking was that this incident highlighted a racism that often lurked in the dark corners of the institution. The press, previously indifferent to these types of incidents, began to report on a reality that many refused to see: racism within the police. Voices were raised, witnesses denounced a climate of suspicion and racial prejudice which, although often ignored or minimized, was systematic and omnipresent. Matthew Lemoyne was not looking for glory or recognition, but he knew that this affair could raise awareness. A few days later, the internal investigation was launched. Officer Durand, already suspected of racist behavior on several occasions, found himself in the spotlight. The investigation, although rapid, was relentless. Testimonies corroborated the accusations. Durand had not only broken the rules, but he had abused his power by making an arrest without legal justification.
Durand's fall was rapid.
First suspended, he was soon fired, his name becoming synonymous with the intolerance and arrogance that corrode from within the institutions supposed to defend the law. Social and media pressure was felt, forcing the authorities to act more decisively. This affair, which could have been a simple altercation, became the catalyst for a much deeper change. Indeed, following the scandal, reforms were implemented in police training. The subject of diversity, equality, and inclusiveness was now addressed more seriously within police academies. The community, the public, and even some police officers sincerely desiring change, came together to discuss ways forward. The incident, although it began as a one-on-one confrontation between a lawman and a racist police officer, became a major turning point for the French police. Captain Matthew Lemoyne, unwittingly, became the face of an ongoing reform. He had never tried to be noticed. He had only done his duty. But justice, beyond the simple execution of the laws, also passed through his voice. In the months that followed, Matthew became a key figure in discussions about racism within law enforcement. He received invitations to participate in debates, to speak at conferences on the revision of police recruitment and training policies, and to share his experience in books and documentaries. What he had experienced in one evening, what he had had to face at the insistence of a racist agent, marked a first step in a series of changes which, if still uncertain, heralded a future where, perhaps, prejudices would have less place. It was not just the fall of Durand. It was the promise of a future where the police, an institution charged with enforcing the law, could one day truly embody the ideals of justice and equality to which they claimed. And Matthew, this man whose discretion was matched only by his inner strength, would be one of the most powerful witnesses.